Okay, so I'm assuming many of you probably visited Conner Prairie. You may or may not know the backstory, or just when you work at Lilly. Eli Lilly purchased the property in 1934, and he envisioned it as a place where Hoosiers could come to learn about and reflect on their pioneer forebears. So it opened its doors in 1974 as a living history museum. Sorry, I'm so not a PC person. It's not letting me move my. You can see my notes. This will. Okay. I want to this. Can't see that.
Oh, yeah, you think that's a little slow.
Okay, I think it's
also-
going to work out.
And also.
Okay. Okay, sorry, technical.
Go on that far.
Okay. All right. So Conner Prairie opened its doors in 1974 as a living history museum, and it welcomed visitors to a recreated village simulating life in 1836, about 15 years after the forced removal of much of Indiana's native population, which included Miami, Delaware, Mohegan, Shawnee, and Potawatomi peoples. So William Conner had stayed in Indiana, and so he was married to a Delaware woman. With Indian removal, she and their 6 children left. They left first for Missouri, Kansas, then Oklahoma. Conner Prairie currently is working on a new exhibit about McKinjus, about his Delaware wife, in consultation with descendants of McKinjus and William Conner. So that's exciting news coming later this year that it should be opening up. William Conner stayed in Indiana. He married several months later to a white woman and had 10 more children. Yes. Sorry, I'm struggling with this. Okay. So William Conner has been kind of immortalized in state history as a pioneer of Indiana, and this is a marker that stands out there at Conner Prairie. On this spot, on a beautiful moonlit night on August 12, 1802, William Conner, with only the aid of a French Canadian, finished his double log cabin trading post. So this may or may not be, it's kind of hidden on Conner Prairie. I don't think that's really open, but you can find it. And then this other marker, on May 28, 1920, the 10 commissioners appointed by the General Assembly met here to select a site for the permanent state capital of Indianapolis. So this kind of memorializes him as one of the first white settlers who established a trading post and then helped launch the official political history of the state of Indiana. This is just me and my daughter over the years, our visits to Conner Prairie. If your children grew up here, you've probably been on the same kinds of trips, seeing animals, seeing the different craftspeople at work. This has been Civil War town. So today, the original design had almost no reference to the native peoples of Indiana. But today you can visit Conner's house to learn about his first wife. There's a plaque there. There's a little bit of information. And today the grounds include not only Prairie Town from 1836, but also the Lenape Indian Camp, which is meant to represent life in 1816. So part of the project that I've been working on is creating a story map, a digital story map to tell the prequel of the Conner family. So often the way the story is presented or the way it's perceived is that a white settler came here as a trader. He married a native woman. The native peoples had been living here forever. They briefly married, and then that's the end. Well, this story is far more complex than that. That the native residents on the White River. Many of them were also pioneers who had been pushed this way by white settlers and established new lives along the White River. And it turns out, in fact, that the native peoples on the White River, the Connor family, and German settlers had all basically traveled together from the 18th century in Pennsylvania to Ohio in the 1770s and on to Indiana in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. So I wanted to get at the complexity of what were those relationships, why were these groups traveling, and what were their relationships? So this is a map that I've made. I can get it to play here. This is a map that's in an old book called Sons of the Wilderness, which is published in 1940, I think it is. It has a map of the native towns that are along the White River. And then I've placed that over a tradition, a map that we recognize. So in fact, this point is actually right around where Oliver's Woods is right. And so we think that's where there was a Delaware village.
Can you go back? Is that possible?
I think I can replay it, but I don't think I can play it backwards. I'm very proud of that technical achievement. William Connor, his life is far more complicated than that story of white settler come to native lands would suggest. He was born in Ohio to white parents, Richard and Peggy Connor, who had lived much of their lives as members of a Shawnee community. He and his siblings were raised in a Muncie and Mohican community affiliated with German Moravian Protestant missionaries, and they became fluent in Muncie, Shawnee, English, and German. Both William and his brother John married Muncie women, and we know that John at least participated in the traditional Muncie religious ceremonies such as the big house dance. So how did this happen? And I'd like to complicate that story by looking at by investigating the prequel, the origin story of the Connor family. And it goes back to the early 1700s, and eastward to the Tuscaroras, and then farther east to Pennsylvania. Okay, so here's a little bit of family tree to orient you a little bit. David Zeisberger is a missionary, so he's not married to any of this, but he's a German missionary, obviously plays a key part of this. So here's William Connor, Paris, Richard and Peggy. His grandfather, Richard Connor, came from Ireland and was living probably in Maryland. We don't really know how or when he showed up in the Ohio country or why. He could have been kind of Daniel Boone-ish, going on hunting trips. Peggy Connor, you'll notice that at least quite a bit of age. Yeah. Yeah, she's good back. And she was, well, I'll tell her the story, that she was born as a German settler family in Pennsylvania in early 1700s. Her kid was Connor, and her father was Chief William Connor, also known as Cape-Wayne, who had been born in Pennsylvania in the Susquehanna Valley in the 1750s. Mother, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, I'm sorry. Her great-grandfather, her great-grandfather was Nebuchadnezzar, who was a renowned chief of the Delaware. And he had established a community in the Tuscaroras Valley in Ohio in the late 1750s. So, yeah. Yeah. So his father is apparently Swedish, very industrious. That's, we don't have a lot of information.
What they did that.
Pennsylvania, yeah. Yeah,
Now, how would Laura was a Moravian missionary
yes,
in Indiana,
yes.
which made the deceased,
Zeisberger? Zeisberger was there first.
oh, wow.
Yep.
Okay, but he's,
Heckwelder is a younger assistant.
oh,
To
so he's
Zeisberger.
Chris Crosby, but he comes Indiana.
Yes,
Missionary.
yep.
Thank you.
All right, so Lenape hulking is the term, so the Lenni Lenape is the native term for what we've grown up knowing as the Delaware tribe. These are different communities within the Lenape. And these were their homelands in Pennsylvania. So how did these two Pennsylvania families, the Lenape family of McKingis's ancestors and the German and Irish family of Connor's ancestors. So in 1737, has anybody heard of the walking purchase? Of course, Mariana has. It's just automatic. It was a fraud in which Pennsylvania claimed 1.2 million acres of Lenape private homelands. And so that essentially pushed Lenape peoples out of Pennsylvania and started their movement first westward, farther west in Pennsylvania, then into Ohio. So fraudulent cessions like the walking purchase sent white settlers flooding into native lands, which often provoked retaliatory attacks by native communities who didn't want squatters on their land, which often resulted in war, which resulted in further land cessions, which resulted in more white settlers pouring in, and the cycle continued over and over again. So this community of, there were two westward movements then of native peoples, both of those who had identified and affiliated with the missionaries were not spared from that movement. They were also pushed westward, along with those who were openly hostile, understandably, to white settlers squatting on their lands. So the first settlers to build their towns and plant fields in the Susquehanna Valley, in the Allegheny, in the Tuscarawas Valley, and the White River valleys, these were all native peoples who were in fact the first pioneers of this region, I would say. That they preceded the white settlers often. So they were pushed farther westward to this area, which was the native land, the homelands of the Miami people. They were offered a place to settle by the Miamis. And in the late 18th century, Pictawaynoon, Chief William Anderson, as well as Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee Prophet, were among those who established new settlements along the White River in the wake of the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. So most native communities adapted elements of European culture that suited them. They built shingled log houses, they raised livestock, and practiced a mix of traditional and European agriculture, while striving above all to secure the land that would enable them to maintain their people. So again, another little nifty map that I can play. So this is the Tuscarawas Valley in Ohio. So it's a little bit about an hour east of Columbus and a little north. You can see Connors, that is the Shawnee town where Richard Connor and Peggy Connor were living. We don't think the native people called it Connorstown, but that's what white passers through assumed, that because there was a white man living there, we should name the town Connorstown. Give you a little bit. Okay. Yep. Yeah. So New Philadelphia is where Yeah, just out there is human children. So while the Connors, Munseys, and the Moravians all had roots in Pennsylvania, they first met in Ohio in the 1770s. And so I'd like to focus on that meeting. So Chief Netawatwees in 1772 invited the Moravian affiliated Lenape. So he was trying to consolidate Lenape people. So Netawatwees was not baptized, was not affiliated with the Moravian missions, but he invited his fellow Lenape people who were still farther eastward to come join him in this valley in order to secure, keep his people together. All right. So here's a part of his speech. So here are the words of Netawatwees, the chief of Gitkamela. For a while, I can say this. Gitkamela. You are herewith informed that I have cleared a straight road from here to the Susquehanna, which is safe and which you can use without fear. The land of the Delawares is here on the Muskingum River. Tuscarawas is a tributary of the Muskingum. There they shall live in an isolated place where nobody will drive them away. This stretch of land has been given to us by the Delamantanos, the Wyandots, and belongs to us. So here's the invitation of the Delaware chief inviting the Moravian affiliated Muncie and Mohican to join them in the Tuscarawas Valley. We confirmed the message with the belt of wampum. That's not the actual belt of wampum. We don't have that particular one. And it was delivered to David Zeisberger and community, the leaders and all the members of the Moravian Native community. So when Netawatwees first met David Zeisberger, he was already Netawatwees was well into his 90th decade. He had been born in 1686 in the lower Delaware Valley, which were the traditional homelands of the Unami or Turtle clan of the Lenape. And he was born just a few years after King Charles II had granted William Penn a charter to the lands between Maryland and New York. And his name signaled one who is a skilled advisor. So Zeisberger visited Netawatwees in his home. This town that had about 700 residents in it. Many of them were living in shingled two-story buildings. And Zeisberger described Netawatwees' house as a studded house with a floor and stairs of cut wood. It has a brick chimney, a shingle roof, and is the biggest one in the town. A few other houses have shingle roofs too. The countryside is beautiful and consists of a vast plain. The land on both sides of the river is good. So with the invitation to the Moravian Lenape, Netawatwees hoped to solidify the Lenape center of population, and he believed religious pluralism was the way to do it. And he said, if any of us wants to go to you, the Moravian missionaries, and to hear the word of God, I will not prevent him. On the contrary, I shall be pleased because I like to hear it myself. So another aspect that we herald as part of our pioneer heritage is religious freedom. And so Zeisberger, he's trying to call attention to what distinguishes the Moravians from other white people that the native peoples have encountered. So there's one more thing which we must insist. We want to live by ourselves. Not that we intend to monopolize the land. We shall not prove troublesome to anybody. On the contrary, we will endeavor to be at peace with everyone. We expect the same from you, namely that you will not be hostile to us. We also want to inform you that the Indians from Freedom Student are going to bring their teachers with them. So he's saying, okay, we want the freedom to teach our religion. And the Pennsylvania Council, the Native Community Council, together with Zeisberger, weighed the invitation. And then Zeisberger delivered the response. He said, and so it was decided that nearly 300 Muncie Mohicans affiliated with the German Moravian missions would settle along the Tuscarawas Valley. So they started first with a settlement they called Welhik Tupek, which means Schönbrunn. And it was established just a few miles upriver from Netawatwee's home village of Ilapachunk, which was also known as Newcomers Town. So if you're passing through there today, it's Newcomers Town. This exchange was significant because it cemented the plan to reunite the Lenape community on the Tuscaroras after decades of war and upheaval. Right. And here's the quote from Zeisberger, distinguishing himself. I've often heard that many of you have said, why should we believe in the white people? They look quite different than we do because their skin is white and ours is brown. We do not want you to believe in the white people, but in the Savior, because you can learn very bad things from the white people. You call me Shwanak, which means white man. We can see that you do not make any difference between us and all the other white people. I take it you realize that my way of living is different from that of other white people. We are the children of God, and all those who believe in God and his 5 moons are our brothers and sisters, whether their skin is white, brown, or black. Yeah. The Moravians early on, unfortunately, they weren't, by the end of the 18th century, they were a lot more like their Anglo-Protestant missionaries. So when David Zeisberger helped negotiate the arrangements to build a new town on the Tuscaroras, he was many thousands of miles from the place of his birth in the Carpathian Mountains, where he was born in 1721 to parents who were members of the Unity of the Brethren, which was an illegal Protestant sect in the Catholic province of Moravia. So his family had fled from Moravia to nearby Saxony when he was 6, and then to America when he was 15. At 21, he began his career as a missionary, first traveling throughout Haudenosaunee territory, which the Iroquois or Six Nations lands in the 1740s, where he learned Seneca and Mohawk, and then among the Lenape, with whom he would spend the rest of his life. And by the time they encountered the Moravian missionaries, the Lenape and Mohicans had over 100 years of contact with European settlers, resulting in devastating losses of their kinspeople to disease and losses of land to settlers. So these twin losses prompted religious crises. Nativist prophets urged resistance, while others saw in the Moravian missionaries a middle ground, a way to secure title to their lands as Christians within British colonies. The Moravian missionaries had proved themselves to be quite different from their English counterparts. They learned to speak native languages. They did not seek to establish white towns on native lands, and they lived and worked side by side with their natives. This is the original plot of this has been reconstructed at Schönbrunn. If you pass through there, they've reconstructed the cabins, the river, the limited field, the local pocket. And this is the marks of the route that the community took from Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania. I think that was really an amazing account of John Heckler traveling with the community. So that was how they got from western Pennsylvania with their cattle, with their canoes, with their there's recently been, they're starting to put some statues up to mark the history of the town. Okay, I know I want to be careful about time. So getting to Peggy Connor finally. So this is a Baptist missionary who passed through the area in 1773. He went to that town marked as Connor's Town, but probably has another Shawnee name that we don't know. So both Peggy and her sister, well, all 3 siblings were taken captive, but so then she grew up among the Shawnee. She and her sister both lived in this town. So Peggy married Richard Connor, and her sister married the Shawnee chief of the community. So this Baptist missionary remarks about Peggy Connor, these women were captives, and it is likely from childhood. So they have the very actions of Indians, and they speak broken English. It seems strange to me to see that captives have the same gestures of Indians. Might we not infer from hence that if Indians were educated as we are, they would be like us? He didn't get many takers. He was turned back by everywhere he went. He wanted to missionize among the Shawnee. They didn't want to. So here is the kind of timeline of Peggy's life. So this is during one of those retaliatory, one of those moments when white settlers were flooding into native lands and Shawnee and Delaware were retaliating. So there were many attacks. She and her siblings were taken. Her brother was returned. The most and her sister remained.
Yeah, you could scroll and close it.
Take that away. It's not showing up on mine.
That's all right.
Oh, I need to get it over there. Oh, I'm not sure there's much covered up there. So she was living in the Shawnee community when they had their first child with Lord Dunmore's War in 1774 between backcountry Virginians and native residents of Ohio. That ended with the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, one provision of which was freeing all of the captives. So technically now she was free to leave, and I think she probably made the decision that it was so, could see the writing on the wall that living in a Shawnee community was no longer a viable future. And so she and Richard left. They went to Pittsburgh, Fort Pitt first, and she was like, too many traders, soldiers, drunk people. I don't want to be there. They had visited with Zeisberger, and they visited at Schönbrunn, which was a couple years old at that point. And so they petitioned to move to Schönbrunn and settle there. So they moved and they became the only white people living in the community that were not missionaries. So Schönbrunn is near New Philadelphia, in Newcomers Town. Yes, yeah. So both William and John were born into those communities where they're living as the only, and they were they both became communicant members of the Moravian. You need to double check that. But it was an unusual circumstance.
That big boy, earlier there was foul.
We think, yeah, it shows up. I should have been pizza cinnamon there, but
But it's the same.
it's the same, yeah. So then and interestingly, a Shawnee captain, as the Revolutionary War escalated, Shawnee captain came to the Moravian community in 1777, and the Moravians described him as Peggy's brother. And I take that as a really interesting comment. So I'm assuming that this is the husband of her sister. And I mean, it's just a little tidbit, but the fact that the missionary is saying Peggy's brother visited suggests to me that her identity, that she truly did identify as Shawnee. And she lived there since she was 6. So not surprising. So he warned her and the mission residents of potential danger. And Zeisberger wrote about the captain that he had indeed come with the intention of picking her up because times were so dangerous now, and he feared he would someday see his sister taken away as a prisoner, which he would not like. So again, these ties remained, and this is William Connor's mother. So it shows her travels where she was born. She died here. So she lived in Clinton, and then she died in 1807. So here is the reconstructed cabin with the big Zeisbergers and the Connors. They have the biggest cabin, interestingly, in Schönbrunn. And so I wanted to just end there with kind of a parting question of, how might Peggy Connor and her children have understood their identity? Like, who is she? How did her identity shift over the years? And how does that, how do we think about what all this means for our understanding of the region's history. And I wanted to leave you with one parting image, which I find really interesting. So this is a postcard, which from the type, I'm assuming is from the 1940s, 30s, 40s. And it says Shinbro, first town in Ohio, begun May 3rd, 1772 by David Dyson. Is it the first town in Ohio? And that's Washington lived, his town was nearby with 800 people living in it. So how do you define town? Right, presumably then do they mean white town? Well, it's not a white town. Do they mean Christian town? Well, yes, but then they haven't been any indication that this was a native town. So I find it, and one of my students found another version of this postcard, which I should get this on, I need to get an image of it, which has a rustic wooden fence, no cars, and no flag. And it's really interesting to think about which came first. Is are they trying to make it like more American? Or is the push towards something more rustic? But I'm assuming this white picket fence is the later version. Yeah.
And to show you are aware of the fact that the word town is equal to the German word Sauer, C-A-U-N, which means fence or fortification. And so that makes sense that it is a town because it's fenced in and it's sort of an enclosed here.
I'm guessing this is just a 20th century projection onto not an attempt at historic accuracy of or understanding of the German heritage. I could be wrong, but yeah.
What does that place look like now?
It is the whole set, all of those, I mean, that earlier platted. So these are all reconstructed.
Is that TK?
Yeah. And so they all look like this, and you can go in and see the.
So this is a open air museum sort of thing?
Yeah, so this is his historic Schönbrunn village
In Schönbrunn.
in Schönbrunn.
So we could go visit.
You can go visit. And they've been working with the descendant communities to, shift the interpretation that's presented at the site.
So Marie is in what's now Czech.
Yes.
But they were ethnic German.
No, well, so the Moravians are pre-Reformation Protestant. They were saying, Jan Hus is claimed as the founder. He was burned at stake in 1415, saying many of the same things Luther would 100 years later. So with the so then this group was suppressed and underground, and then kind of popped up and sought asylum in Saxony in the 1720s, and Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf kind of gave them refuge, gave them asylum. And so Zeisberger's family was one of those first to go from Moravia to Saxony. And that's where kind of the worldwide Moravian church grew from that 1720s in Saxony with some original Moravian refugees, but then they grew a lot, they gained a lot of Lutheran converts.
So the original Moravian people aren't necessarily ethnic German.
No, but the Moravian church grew to become mostly Germans because most people came from Lutheran congregations in Saxony, so there was only a small.
Hope, Indiana,
It's Moravian.
Moravian.
Yeah.
German.
Yes. So, yeah, the modern German church mostly emerges from the 1720s movement, which brought in lots of ethnic Germans.
They, the Moravians were Anabaptists, right?
No, no,
Are they
no.
completed baptism? Real baptism?
they're not at all a part of the Anabaptist movement. So it's they're kind of like the, the Methodist offshoot of the Anglicans, so they're the evangelical movement within, so they're more tied to the Pietist movement.
Because the Lutherans didn't necessarily like them.
No, they did not. Especially in the 30s and 40s. They were all about the Blutenwunden Jesu. Which was,
What were some of the main Moravian visions and stuff? There's hope and
there's hope, I mean, they established a mission on the White River, which was not very successful. There's Bethlehem, Pennsylvania is the northern headquarters of the Moravian Church. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, is another Moravian, one of the early establishments. So there are lots in Pennsylvania and in North Carolina. Wisconsin has a significant.
at the same time that the British were pushing and they're earlier pushing it. The Native American tribes way westward, were the French pushing down the Canadian polar.
Pushing the native communities?
Yeah.
I mean, the French settlement was so different. I mean, fish, faith, and fur has been the shorthand for French settlement, that they were not seeking land. So they were seeking trade. So it didn't exert the same pressures on native communities. They tended to adapt.
The settlements along the wall actually like that. We got and in since they were trading well.
They were more trading posts, but yeah. Yeah, the British obviously didn't like it, wanted those connections broken.
This is very fast.
I think. Yeah,
I think I got this right. I think the Ravens and Hope moved from North Carolina.
could be, and I'm afraid I don't.
Yeah. Because of the influence later.
Oh, yeah,
And then they only put 50.
okay, that makes sense. Past like 1815, my Moravian history is.
It's really interesting to like with Connor's mother, the background that she had, the Indians, the English, how very cosmopolitan in its own way.
Yeah,
So you appropriately point out that we, in this American context, identity is up with France.
yeah, and it makes me wonder all the more, like, what was that decision when William married McKinjes and then said, okay, goodbye, and remarried? And I mean, my sense is not that this was an evil plot all along of how to extort native lands. I think there was more of a calculus of like, and this, especially perhaps Peggy, that she was living a fine life, that saw the writing on the walls that, okay, it's no longer viable and now I can choose to be white again. And she did. To Michigan.
Michigan and then to
Then the sons came to Indiana, but she and Richard stayed in Michigan.
so maybe and then Connorsville.
That's where John Connor had his trading post.
John is,
William's brother.
oh yeah, brother.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, I don't want to step on another.
I'll deliver the last question. Last word was still tell. Yeah, thank you. The brick house.
Yeah. That was built after.
So that was for wife and number two.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, wife number two comes the next time. Okay. I'll begin with my thought. We're here to actually help develop. Yeah, well, in 71 and 72, there was the William Connor House was open and, you know, you could visit it. It was before the museum.
Mhm.
And so I worked a couple of on building day with
Oh, cool.
the Pioneer Village. So we went around the state and found log cabins and buildings.
Right, and brought
I'd actually met, Little, he was driving around campus.
Wow.
The young workers, and it was pretty exciting.
Wow, very
That
cool.
was all my own.
Right. Yeah. Great.
Are there any questions online? I know Maria was, talking about the Moravian Star that they sell at Carmel Christian Market. So I know, on the phone with a couple of them.
You just told me she wants to add the storage, but we'll collect the next.
Yeah, she wants to add to the culture. Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Wood.